and I'm just going to be right in front. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Or perhaps I should say good evening, and it's getting a little later. My name is Joy Connolly. I'm the president of the American Council of Learned Societies, and I want to extend the warmest possible welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming. It is a great honor, and it gives me distinct pleasure to introduce to you the 2023 Charles Homer Haskins Prize Lecturer, Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. Professor Gates is the 41st winner of the Haskins Prize, which is named in honor of the first director of ACLS. Now, Professor Gates is the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. And these are his formal titles. But the breadth of his work and the long list of his accomplishments transcends titles. Professor Gates is a scholarly adventurer, a path blazer, a builder of bridges, and a connector of communities. He has made an indelible mark as a scholar of literature, culture, and history, as a wise guide to the challenges of our age, and rare for scholars, he's truly a household name. A recent article in The New Yorker titled "The End of the English Major" left many members of the ACLS community worried about the state of public understanding of the humanities and interpretive social sciences. It's been a topic of some of our discussions here in the last couple of days. Well, we can all take comfort and, I hope, inspiration too from Professor Gates, because in the public arena, he's one of our strongest and most active advocates. He reaches audiences all around the world, not only through books and articles, but through newspapers, movies, and television. Astonishingly, along with his many publications and his above and beyond institutional service, which I'll get to in a moment, he has created over 20 films and TV series. 2 of them, The Black Church on PBS and Frederick Douglass in 5 Speeches on HBO, which he executive produced, were nominated for the Emmy. Many of you will know his PBS show, Finding Your Roots. I'll venture that the most world-weary cynic cannot watch this show without feeling flares of sympathetic excitement as the participants learn about their families' pasts. But the show moves beyond personal surprises to explore the social and political pressures behind the secrets families keep, and unexpected insights into the history of American migration and labor and daily life, which sometimes appears in the materials you share unimaginably toilsome and difficult. As Professor Gates himself once described the show, it's part of a larger mission to inspire us all to see history as something that we all have a stake in, and in realizing this, to help us arrive at a deeper understanding of what it means to be a part of the human family. In our polarized time, thinking about how we're connected to the rest of the human community is a rare habit, but one we need to teach. And to have made this teaching entertaining as well as thought-provoking was a brilliant move. And you won't be surprised, and I'm very happy to say that Finding Your Roots has completed its 9th season on PBS, and it will return for a 10th in 2024. Professor Gates himself joined the human community in Piedmont, West Virginia in 1950. His parents advised him to become a doctor, but he took his bachelor's degree in history at Yale and went on to study at Cambridge with Wale Soyinka, who convinced him to focus on African and African American literature. He taught at Yale, Cornell, and Duke before joining the faculty at Harvard in 1991. And over the years, he's written or co-written 29 books and edited or co-edited a dozen more. At 31 years old, he was chosen to be a member of the first cohort to be awarded Genius Grants by the MacArthur Foundation. And in 1998, he became the first African-American scholar to be awarded the National Humanities Medal. As a past chair of the Pulitzer Prize Board and as a member now of the boards of the Whitney Museum of American Art, the Studio Museum of Harlem, the New York Public Library, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Aspen Institute, and the Library of America, and I'm sure I've missed some, he brings his intellect and values to bear in shaping American journalism, literature, the law, and the arts. It's no exaggeration to say that Professor Gates has remade the American canon. In fact, it's literally true. He rediscovered the first novel by a Black woman, the antebellum author Harriet E. Wilson, and helped to republish it in 1983. He also recovered Hannah Craft's 1850s novel, The Bondswoman's Narrative, and helped gather the 30-volume Schomburg Library of 19th century Black women writers. As he told David Remnick in The New Yorker, "I became a canon maker, not a canon breaker." Among the reference works he's produced on Black history and culture, I'll mention only the 5-volume set Africana, the Encyclopedia of the African and African American Experience, co-edited with past ACLS board chair Kwame Anthony Appiah. They've been close friends since graduate school. Professor Gates also changed global literary criticism by introducing a new term to it, signifying, in his landmark 1988 book, The Signifying Monkey, which won the American Book Award and has sparked decades of debate. Well, these contributions alone would place Professor Gates in the ranks of the most influential and respected scholars of the 20th and 21st centuries. But he has consistently also worked for the collective good of scholars and society. In the institution building of the field of African American studies, he's played a key role. At Harvard, he recruited an extraordinary cohort of scholars to the Department of African and African American Studies, and he reinvigorated the W.E.B. Du Bois Research Institute, which has become a part of the Hutchins Center. Professor Gates does the work of American history and cultural and literary criticism, guided by an inspiring vision of the common good in a diverse democracy. In one collection of essays, Loose Cannons, and that's cannons with a total of 2 ends, not 3, not the ones that shoot cannonballs, he writes this: "Ours is a world profoundly fissured by nationality, ethnicity, race, class, and gender. And the only way to transcend those divisions, to forge for once a civic culture that respects both differences and commonalities, is through education that seeks to comprehend the diversity of human culture. Beyond the hype and the high-flown rhetoric is a pretty homely truth. There is no tolerance without respect, and no respect without knowledge." He goes on to say that knowledge empowers human beings to understand other cultures, no matter how alien they may at first appear to be. Well, speaking right now, in April 2023, I find myself freshly moved and inspired by his words. This is the work humanistic scholarship and education must do and can do at a moment when identity has become primarily a marker of division and conflict. In all his work, Professor Gates is an example of how scholarship helps to forge what he calls a new and vital common American culture. His studies of African American culture show how it contributed resiliency and creative energy to the rest of the nation in the face of plunder and prejudice. His reparative practice of scholarship advances the highest goals of humanistic education in and for a democracy. He's changed American conversations about heritage and history for the better. So I'm so happy to introduce Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr. to the podium and hear his reflections on his life of scholarship so far. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming.
I don't want you to stop.
I could keep going.
Thank you. Wow, that was an amazing introduction. Give it up to Joy for that. You know, I got so into it. First of all, I wondered who she was talking about. And then I forgot that I had to talk after her. So thank you so very much. It's a great honor for me. I was on this board 100 years ago, I think, when I was at Cornell. And so it's great to be back. I thought, if you don't mind, that the theme of the series, of course, is a life of learning. and I have a second career, and I thought that the appropriate title would be A Life of Relearning, and I would share with you how in the world a guy with a BA in history and a PhD in English language and literature, as they say at the University of Cambridge, ended up with a second career in documentary film, making series for public television about African and Afro-Latin American and African American history, and another one about genetics and genealogy. In other words, how did I stumble onto a second career, step by step, through a life of relearning? So that's my subject this evening. Now, in retrospect, this most unlikely route can be traced to a most modest origin, and that was to a funeral on July 2nd, 1960, when I was 9 years old. Let me give you the series overview first. Oh. So do I click again? Okay. Nope.
Fasten your seatbelt.
My heart is racing right now.
Oh, look at now.
We're not gonna have no Danny Trejo, you are the father.
What do you have, spies working for you? How did you find this?
You're uncovering the truth. I love this.
It's wild. These are consequential things.
Okay, mind blown.
I feel like a time traveler. This is something out of some science fiction novel.
Oh, it's so good. Oh, that's so good. Oh my gosh, I cannot believe this.
Wow. That's very moving, actually. It's like the most vital stuff, right?
I'm sorry, but this really something. Really is something. I mean, I wish my ma could be here to see this.
They didn't need Lincoln to free them. They got free on their own.
They did indeed.
I had a hard time even getting my head there.
I just want to bow down to every nick and scrape and trauma and whip and chain and say, just, you have no idea how much I love you.
On this side of your tree,
I'm an inbred kind of...
inbred.
I'm inbred?
You can't make that stuff up.
Right.
That's funny, but it's life.
No, my ancestors did not come here on the Mayflower.
Your ancestors came
No.
on the Mayflower.
That's a little bit too much.
And you have a DNA cousin.
Oh my God!
That's Bill Hader. You know him?
Of course.
He's my DNA cousin.
He is your DNA cousin.
We work together.
What?
That's right.
That's a good one.
Oh, look at everybody.
What a treasure. Skip, what a treasure. You know, you die twice. You die when your body dies, and then you die the last time somebody says your name.
That's right.
And so I'm gonna make sure that I keep them alive.
I've got history. You know what I mean? That's what it is. I've got history.
I feel the presence of all these people.
Yeah.
In a good way.
This has been freaking amazing.
It is something about knowing.
Uh-huh.
Even with the hard parts, there's an add value to the knowing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I don't want my fake eyelashes to fall off.
Ladies and gentlemen. So in retrospect, this most unlikely route can be traced to a very modest origin, as I said, to a funeral that was held in Cumberland, Maryland, which is about halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., on July 2nd, 1960, when I was 9 years old. This is my grandfather, Edward St. Lawrence Gates, my father's father. This is his obituary in the Cumberland, Maryland Times on Friday, July the 1st. And his funeral was held the next day at the Kite Funeral Home in the middle of Cumberland. Cumberland is in western Maryland on the Potomac near Hagerstown. And this is his baby picture. You can see typical African-American little boy. My grandfather was so white, we called him Casper behind his back. He was the eldest son of Edward Gates and Maud Scott Gates, and he was born in 1879 on the Gates family farm in Mineral County, Patterson's Creek, West Virginia. I was born about 15 miles from there. This is my great-grandfather, Edward, who was born in 1857, and my great-grandmother, Maudeline, who was born in 1854. Now, my grandfather had 3 sisters, and you can see them there, Letitia, Maud, and Pansy. Pansy, curiously enough, was the second child. The first child was a little boy named Eugene Julian Gates, who died in infancy, and when the little girl was born after him, they named the little girl Eugene Julian Gates as well, which drove my great-aunt Pansy totally crazy. But curiously enough, in the beginning of the 20th century, my great-grandparents sent those 3 girls to Howard University and kept my grandfather on the farm to run the farm first, and then our family business. My great-grandfather and my grandfather had a chimney sweep business before people had central heat. They would go early in the morning and light rich people's, coal fires and clean out the chimneys. And then that morphed into a janitorial business. My grandfather loved to garden, and it turned out after his funeral that my brother Paul, I have one brother, Dr. Paul Gates, who's a very distinguished oral surgeon, that we learned about another hobby that my grandfather had. This is my dad. This is Henry Louis Gates, Sr. So following the funeral, my father, we buried my grandfather at the Rose Hill Episcopal Cemetery. The Gates have always been Episcopalian, the true church, my father would say. And then came back to the Gates family home on Green Street, which my family still owns. And then my father took my brother and me upstairs to his parents' bedroom. Now, I don't know about you all, but I never went to my grandparents' bedroom. I never even went upstairs in their house. Back in those days, we had standards, right? You couldn't, you couldn't sit on someone's bed. You couldn't step on a grave. I don't know if you all were raised that way. And God knows you didn't go upstairs in your grandparents' bedroom. They just disappeared at night magically, like, Harry Potter. So when Daddy took Rocky and me, my father's Heine, born in 1913. Paul is Rocky. I'm Skip. My family's really big on nicknames. And so he takes us upstairs, of like going to the moon. And my grandparents' bedroom still does, has a sun porch on it. And he took us out on this sun porch. And sitting on the sun porch was a big armoire. And he opened the armoire, and in it were these bank ledgers. This is one of the bank ledgers. This is the only one that survives. And my brother and I compared notes later. My grandfather was a janitor at the First National Bank of Cumberland, Maryland. And he was stealing, this is a bank ledger from the bank. And he was stealing these bank ledgers. And my brother and I thought, well, we were rich, right? My father was dividing up the family fortune. And, but that was wrong. He was using these bank ledgers as scrapbooks. That was his hobby. He was a gardener, and a beautiful gardener. He grew tulips, and we had a little fish pond for goldfish in the backyard, which we always thought was quite magical. But unbeknownst to anybody, he kept all these scrapbooks. So my father was bringing all these bank ledgers out of the armoire. He was sitting on the ground, and my brother and I were looking over his shoulder. And he was turning the pages furiously. Clearly, he was looking for something that he knew was there. And finally, after maybe 6 or 7 scrapbooks, he found what he was looking for. And he said, this is a page, typical page of one of his scrapbooks. And what I like the fact that my grandfather was a race man. Though he looked white, he could have passed for white, like my father could have. He was a race man. And so there are articles like the first Negro judge in New York City from 1942, and all sorts of other things. But he had a deep and abiding fascination with death. Every kind of plane accident, train wreck, automobile accident, the daily war dead. This is from the middle of World War II, from 1942-43. And every day in the paper, I'm sure some of you know this, your local paper would print the local war dead. He cut that out. He cut it out every day. So Daddy, was turning these pages furiously, and finally he found what he was looking for, and he said, "You boys," he called me boy to the to the day he died. He lived to be 97 and a half, and the last day, he would have called me boy if I would have made it in time. And on the very last day, I met this lady. I mean, on the very last page that he was looking for, he found what he had been searching for, and it was an obituary, and an obituary for this lady. It said, "Died this day in Cumberland, Maryland, Jane Gates, an estimable colored woman," and it was dated January 6th, 1888. An estimable colored woman. And then he showed us this photograph, which was between the pages in the scrapbook. And he said, "This is the oldest Gates on record. I never want you to forget her name, and I never want you to forget her face." No introduction, no conclusion, that was it. Then my brother and I looked at each other. We looked at this funny-looking lady who was a midwife. She was a slave till slavery was abolished in Maryland in 1864, and she had 5 children who all looked white. And in 1870, she purchased the first piece of property in the Gates family. $1,200 she paid in cash for a house in an all-white neighborhood. You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out where that money came from when you look at her white-looking children, right? And we still own that house. In fact, it's now on the historic register. So without warning, my father, on the day that his father died, wanted to ground my brother and me into Gates family history. And he did so. So the next day, that night, we drove back to Piedmont, West Virginia, 25 miles from Cumberland. And my father worked 2 jobs. He worked at the paper mill in the daytime, and then at night, he worked as a janitor in the telephone company. So we always had, we were the richest black people. We were all poor, you have to understand, but poverty and wealth are both relative, right? And because my father worked 2 jobs, we always had the nicest home among the handful of black people in this little paper mill town in eastern West Virginia. And so my brother and I always had our own rooms. I always had a desk, and I had a bookcase. And on my desk next to my bed sat a little red Webster's Dictionary. We can all still remember those, right? And the last thing I did before I went to sleep was look up the word estimable, because I didn't know what it meant. And I thought, wow, if that funny-looking lady's estimable, then maybe I'm estimable too. So the next day was July 3rd, and we went to the colored 4th of July picnic. Now, remember, this is 1960. Miraculously, in Mineral County, West Virginia, Brown v. Boards 54, schools in my county integrated without Rosa Parks and without Martin Luther King, without a peep, in 1955. And I started first grade in 1956. And I never had not like Richard Wright had a teacher who said, little colored boys can't be doctors. I was raised to be a doctor. I was going to be a doctor. And my teachers were always encouraging. I was a little prince of the class, without a doubt. And we had Piedmont, the year I was born, had 2,500 people. It was an Irish-Italian paper mill town. And in fact, and 386 black people, I believe, according to the 1950 federal census. And in fact, the day before I went over, started first grade at the white school, as we called it, my father, the night before, my father called me into our formal living room. Now, we had one of these living rooms where all the furniture was coated with plastic, right? Nobody ever sat on any of that furniture. I don't know who my mother thought was going to come. The Queen Elizabeth was going to come visit the United States and come to our house. And my father said, boy, I want to see you. So he called me in, and I was terrified. And I said, what, Daddy? And he said, we're going over to the white school tomorrow. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, well, there's something important you need to know. And I said, well, what's that? He said, well, there's two kinds of white people. And I go, two kinds of white people? What are they? And he said, the Italians and the Irish, right? And I said, oh, okay. So how do I tell the difference? He said, good boy. That's why I called you in this room. He said, the Irish have names that begin with O. The Italians have names that end with O. True story. And Joy, that I'm here to confess in front of the ACLS is the secret to my success. All these years later. Now, I have to tell you before I go on, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit, and I'm going to walk you through the way I got to making what's become Finding Your Roots. But once I started Finding Your Roots, and I would be interviewed about how in the world I got this idea. And I would tell them the same story that I just told you. And one of our genealogists, a woman named Jane Ailes, in 2006, said to me one day, there's something I need to talk to you about. And I said, what? And she said, we have two obituaries for your great-great-grandmother. And neither mentions the word estimable. And this really shook me. I have genetically good memory. My brother has a perfect memory, photographic memory. My father has my father had a photographic memory. For cards, my family loved to play cards. Rick Powell's going to be playing Bid Whist with my brother. You told me when? Next week? He's retired to Durham. And he's a demon because he has a perfect memory. And all the bones in the body, all the nerves, I don't have that kind of memory, but I have a very good memory for text, right? And I was so shaken because I was absolutely convinced that is what the obituary said, and that when we drove home to Piedmont that night, I looked up the word. I could swear on a stack of Bibles that was true. So I thought, and I looked at the two obituaries, and it just wasn't there. And so the Super Bowl for a genealogist is called Roots Tech, and it's held, of course, in Salt Lake City, where all those billions and trillions of records are kept in caves and stuff. And so I was a keynote speaker right before COVID. And I said, well, I think I would make the fallibility of memory the subject of my talk. And I love to fish. I grew up on the Potomac River. I used to fish with Evelyn's favorite relative of mine is my Uncle Jim, who was like a genius hunter and fisherman. Where I grew up, you got a 410 when you were 12 years old. People there would never, ever go for batting guns, and I never knew anybody who shot anybody or who was killed by a gun. It's just a mountain culture. In fact, growing up in those mountains shaped my personality as much as being black, without a doubt, and there's no question about that. which is one of the reasons I always insist that, you know, we all have multiple identities, and that to be reduced to one label is just stupid. You know, it's ridiculous. So, but anyway, I love to fish. And Joy said that I'm the founding director of something called the Hutchins Center at Harvard, which was founded by Glenn Hutchins. It's a billionaire hedge fund guy. He has his own plane, and every year we go bone fishing, fly fishing, in the Bahamas on Andros at the Flamingo Key Fishing Camp. This is like a rich guy's, you know, playground, and they take me along for the local color, right? So we went fishing that weekend and flying back to New York where Glenn lives, and then they were taking me home to Cambridge. And we were over North Carolina. And I sent an email to our director of research because I was, you know, shaping my remarks for Roots Tech the following Friday. And I just said to this person, could you do a literature search and send me the 2 obituaries for Jane Gates? And so I thought I would riff on them and then just say that you can't trust your memory. The first thing we do when we have a guest at Finding Roots, we interview them, interview the family, and we get all the family stories, and most of them turn out not to be true at all. But it's sort of like the dream work in Freud, right? The elements are there, they're just rearranged. So where there's smoke, there's fire, kind of. So I just wanted to explain this to people, and it was my confession, right, that I had made a mistake. And I thought in front of 10,000 people, this was the ideal place for me to do it. And right away, I get an email back, and it had 3 attachments. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I opened it up, and I read the first 2, and then there was a third one. The third one, which had not been digitized between 2006, when they searched for her obituaries, and 2019, when I was about to speak at Roots Tech. And I'm sitting on this plane, and I read it, and it's very difficult to see, but that obituary says, basically, died this day in Cumberland, Maryland, Jane Gates, an estimable colored one. I said, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus. Really? No, I cried. They looked at me, my friends on this plane, go, what's wrong with you? I go, no, I can't talk about it, I can't talk about it. I was right. I was right. All those years, my 9-year-old memory was absolutely correct. And I couldn't wait to land, and I called that damn Jane Ailes, and I said, God damn, I found it. So that made me feel really good. So the next day, on July 3rd, 1960, now we're at the end of the bracketed tale, right, end of the parentheses. The next day, I went to the colored picnic. And what I was about to say was that our school totally integrated, but you couldn't socialize with the white kids. You couldn't dance with the white kids. God knows you couldn't date across the color line. And in our town, there was a white 4th of July picnic, a white Labor Day picnic, and a colored 4th of July picnic, and a colored Labor Day picnic. So I went to the colored 4th of July picnic, and on the way back, I asked my father if we could stop at Red Bull's newsstand, which is more like a convenience store now. And I asked him if he would buy me a composition book, which he did. And that night, in front of our 12-inch black and white RCA Victor television, I don't know what was on, Bonanza, or I guess it was Saturday, it was Gunsmoke, right? Some of you are old enough to remember 3 channels and the lineup. I interviewed my parents about what only years later I would learn is called one's family tree or one's genealogy. And I got back to my great-great-grandmother on my father's side, who had no husband but had those 5 white-looking children. And I got back to my great-great-grandmother and great-great-grandfather on my mom's side. And so that was it. And because I wanted to know how in the world I could be descended from a man who looked so white that we mocked him by calling him Casper behind his back. How could he be my grandfather? And then how could his grandmother be that woman who was dressed in her midwifery suit and who was a slave until 1864. Phenotypically, they look so dramatically different. And I wanted to try to figure it out. So, and that's the best that I could do. Well, I would lose the composition book. But I'd wake up one day and I'd want to know those names again. So I'd ask my father to buy another composition book. He said, "God damn it, boy, I bought you a composition book." I said, "Yeah, but I still want to know about my ancestors." And, you know, I would see coats of arms, crests, in the back of the Washington Post. Our daily newspapers came, the Baltimore Sun and the Washington Post, as well as the Cumberland, Maryland Times. And in the back of the Sunday supplement would be, for $50 or whatever, you could buy a coat of arms. But I knew if I bought the Gates, well, one, I couldn't afford it anyway, but if I had bought the Gates coat of arms, the Gates family crest, it wouldn't have been my Gates. Though we had one family story that twisted our lineage such that it ended with Horatio Gates, you know, General Horatio Gates from the Revolution, who had a farm in Berkeley County, West Virginia. And we were figuring, well, maybe Jane was a slave, and then maybe she got lost and got to Cumberland, Maryland. You know, typical fabrication and fantasy genealogy, like in so many of your families, I'm sure. So, cut to oh, by the way, this is my favorite family photo. There's my beautiful mom, and there's my dad, and there's my brother Paul, and there's little old me. Now, make no mistake about it, that lady in that photograph wanted both of her little boys to be medical doctors. For my mother, in heaven, there's a Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost, and a medical doctor. I got stethoscopes for Christmas. I got dissecting kits. You know, that was it. And we were going, and even when I took the SATs, my SATs are about my quantitative 50 points higher than my qualitative. And there was no question about it. Well, that's not the way it ended up, but that was the plan. So, cut to 1977. It's the biggest thing in the history of television, Alex Haley's Roots. I watched it like so many of you in this room. I watched it every night. And you could say, at the end of the week, I had a severe case of Roots envy. I wanted to be like Alex Haley and reverse the middle passage and forget who Father Jane Gates' children. I wanted to reverse the middle passage and find out what ethnic group we were from in Africa. But only Alex Haley could do that, right? And I finally met Alex Haley. Quincy Jones' daughter, Rashida, was our student at Harvard. Quincy and I became friends. Quincy Jones scored the music for Roots, which we tend to forget. And so once he introduced me to Alex, and I looked at him with such deep envy that he had been able to pull this thing off. Well, I go to Harvard in 1991. The first person I recruited is Evelyn Higginbotham, who's sitting right there in the front row. And on May 11th, 1992, I gave a lecture on political correctness for the Utah Academy of Arts and Sciences. And it was a Friday night. And the next day, you know, you jet lag when you fly west, right? So the next day I woke up at 5 a.m. and I was thinking, and my flight back to Boston was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So I thought, what the hell can I do in Salt Lake City? And then I remembered the Family History Library. And so I looked it up. No, I didn't look it up. I called to see, you know, and got the recording. And to see if it was open on Saturday, and of course it was. So I can't remember if it was open at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock in the morning. But I got there about 15 minutes after it opened, and this place was packed, man. I mean, there were mostly women, mostly older women, but women of every stripe. Asian women, white women, Christian women, Jewish women, Muslim women. They were just everybody. And when I walked in, I just was so astonished at how crowded it was. And then a woman in the corner stood up and said, I found her, I found my grandmother, I found my grandmother. And everybody got up and went over and hugged her, the whole thing. I went, wow, man, this is electric. This is really cool. So that stayed with me, right? So this is 1992. In the year 2000, I got a letter from a black geneticist at Howard University. His name was Dr. Rick Kittles. And he said, Dear Dr. Gates, have you ever watched Roots? And I was saying, what kind of idiot does he think I am, you know? He went on to say, we can now do what Alex Haley purported to do, we can do in a test tube. We can do in a laboratory. We can trace your mitochondrial DNA, your mother's mother's mother DNA, back to Africa, and we can reveal what your origins were. He had no idea that I'd been obsessed with my own family tree since I was 9 years old. And so I called him. He was in his lab. He said he was trying to get 2,000 black men to be volunteers in this study. And he was having trouble. He was having trouble getting volunteers. I'll tell you why in a few minutes. But I called him. I was so excited. This was going to be my Kunta Kinte moment, right? I was going to find my African ancestors. So I called him and I said, Dr. Kittles, you don't know it, but you come to the right place. I have been obsessed with finding my ancestors since I was 9 years old. I will pay you to come up tomorrow to Harvard Square. We lived on Francis Avenue where the Divinity School is on campus. And I said, whatever it costs, just come up. And he came up, and he sat in my living room, and he told me about the wonders of mitochondrial DNA and how it all worked. And I go, yeah, you know, I didn't care about that. I said, let's just do it. So then he pulls out a needle, you know, and now, as you all know, to take a DNA test, you just spit in a test tube, right? Then, to get a sufficient amount of tissue, they had to extract your blood. Now, Dr. Rick Kittles is many things. He's a very brilliant scientist, but he is not a brilliant extractor of blood. And after 45 minutes, now I have fabulous veins. And you can see Suzanne Blier right there. I have really good veins. But after 45 minutes of him not fighting my veins, I decided I didn't really want to know where I was from in Africa. But finally, you know, he struck gold. And I tell my students this, and then he put it in a cooler, you know, with dry ice, and just got on a plane with my blood and flew back to Washington, D.C. Those were the days, right? 6 months come and go, and I don't hear from Rick Kittles. So I keep calling him, no answer, no answer. And finally, a friend of mine said, call him from a different number. And I went, oh, okay. So I called him from a different number. He answered the phone, Rick Kittles. And I go, Rick, it's Skip Gates. I want to know where I'm from in Africa. He said, man, I was just about to call you. I said, yeah. Where am I from? He said, your results were so anomalous, we had to run them again and again. I go, yeah, just tell me where I'm from. He said, you are the only person among 2,200 people we've analyzed, you descend from the Nubian people. Now, I don't know if you know, but the Nubians were always at war with the Egyptians. The Nubians were clearly black. Egypt got its gold from Nubia. The kingdom of Cush in the Bible, that's Nubia, right? Remember the Candace, the queen of Meroe, the book of Acts sends her treasurer. Philip the evangelist bumps into him. All that's real, right? And you want to be Nubian. African Americans either want to be Nubian or Zulu. You want to be Nubian because the 25th dynasty of Egypt was the black pharaoh. You know, people argue, you know, Netflix is releasing this film and Cleopatra's black. This is total bullshit. Cleopatra was not black. She was not black. She was Greek. Everybody knows that. Or everybody except the people who make this film that's about to come out. She was not black. And many of you know here, I am a finder of lost black people. I love bringing in black people. If we found out that Shakespeare had a black ancestor, he would be in the Norton Anthology of African American Men. But you know what else would happen? My colleagues in English would say, you know, we've been thinking about that Shakespeare. All those cliches, to be or not to be, you know. He was not as great as we remember. So African Americans want to be Nubians, or they want to be Zulu. Why Zulu? Because Shaka Zulu converted the spear from a weapon used like that to a weapon used like that, which makes you very, very effective. And he consolidated the kingdom in Zululand, in what is now South Africa. The only problem is none of our African ancestors who came to the United States came here from Nubia. Nubia ran from about Khartoum to the first cataract, the Aswan Dam, right? So what was my ancestor going to do? Walk across the Sahara Desert? What, so you could get a free ride on a slave ship to pick cotton in Mississippi or Alabama? No, I don't think so. But that was all right, because Rick Kittle said I was Nubian, and he sent me my certificate of Nubianality. And you know, my best friend's Anthony Opie, right? So I showed it to Anthony, Anthony is a prince. Anthony's uncle was the Asantehene, the king of the Asante. On his father's side, his mother's side, his grandfather was Sir Stafford Cripps, the chancellor of the exchequer. So I showed it to Anthony. I go, look, Anthony, I'm descended from this Nubian, maybe a pharaoh, you know. And Anthony looked at it and said, what a ton of rubbish. And I thought, you're just jealous, you know. You are just jealous. So I had my DNA certificate framed, and it hung proudly in my house for 3 years. One night, I got up. I don't mean to be indelicate. I got up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. And I'm standing in the bathroom, I swear to God, and I got the idea that became Finding Your Roots, that I could get 6 prominent African Americans and 8 prominent African Americans, and I would trace their family tree back to the abyss of slavery. And when the paper trail ran out, which inevitably it does for everybody, and certainly for African Americans in slavery, then I would do their DNA and see where they were from in Africa. And I stood there, ladies and gentlemen, with tears running down. When I walked in that bathroom, I did not have this idea. And standing there, the whole idea came like a gift from God. And I was so excited. I went back to bed, but I couldn't go to sleep. And the next day, I called Quincy Jones. Now, Quincy, being a jazz musician, Quincy's like a vampire. You know, Quincy's up all night and goes to bed when the sun comes up, right? So if you want to do business with Quincy, you can't call him till about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I waited impatiently, and finally at 3 o'clock I called. His person answered the phone, and his friends called him Q, and I said, could I please speak to Q with something urgent I need to talk to him about? And I said, Q, what if I could do for you what Alex did for himself? Would you be in my series? And Quincy's a very clever man. The first thing he said was, does it hurt? And I did what you would do, ladies and gentlemen. I lied. I said, oh, of course not, man. It's a piece of cake. And he said, okay, I'll be in. So then I wanted Quincy to be in because he's Quincy Jones, right? And he was my friend at Roots and the whole thing. But I also wanted him to be in for another reason. Does anybody know who Quincy Jones' best friend is? No, well, it used to be. Michael Jackson made Quincy a really wealthy man. But his best friend is Oprah Winfrey. And I wanted him to ask Oprah to be in the series. Now, Quincy and I were in Miami once, and Oprah was coming to dinner, but she got out of a limo that was about as long as this room, and she stood by our table, never sat down. She sort of smiled at me, but we didn't really connect, so I didn't know her. And so I waited. I didn't want to be vulgar or so apparent about it, right? And so I tap danced a little bit on the phone. How's Rashida? How does she like her class at Harvard? How's your wife? Blah, 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 blah. How's Michael? And then finally I said, would you ask Oprah to be in the series? And he said, no. I said, damn. Why did I need Oprah? Because I needed $6 million. And nobody had done a series like this. So I didn't even know if I could do it. And nobody was going to give me any money, right? So I thought if I got Quincy and Oprah, then I had a fighting chance. So he said, no, I'm not going to ask her, but I'm going to do you one better. I am going to give you her nom de plume. You know, I'm give you her secret name and address, and you can write to her. And I said, well, what am I supposed to do with that? He said, write her a snail mail letter. So I thought, man, that's the coldest brush off that I've ever received. And I was very frustrated. And I said, well, the idea was not meant to be. It was a fantasy anyway. Went to bed. Next day, sat down, wrote Oprah Winfrey a snail mail letter. Took it to Harvard Square, put it in the mailbox myself. 6 months, come and go, no response from Oprah Winfrey. And I was watching, I always grade, you know, in my seminar, like I'm sure for yours, there's a weekly paper, right? A one-page paper. And so I like to grade them watching the NFL. For some reason, I find those guys beating each other and crashing and doing all that very relaxing. And I was grading papers, and my cell phone rang, and it was Quincy calling. I said, hey, Q, what's up? And a deep woman's voice said, Dr. Gates, this is Oprah Winfrey. And I said, thank you, Jesus. Thank you, Jesus. You know why? I knew it was good news, because rich people don't call you with bad news. They don't. Their assistant calls and said, Miss Winfrey got your letter, and she would like to thank you for your consideration, but the answer is no. And she said, I would be honored to be in your series. So I went into Johnson & Johnson, which became my founding sponsor. And I told them about Alex Haley and, you know, blah, 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 the DNA stuff. And then I said, how would you like the whole world learning what ethnic group Oprah Winfrey's from in Africa, and your products, your company, being associated with that revelation? You know what it was like? You see that chandelier? Imagine if that whole section of the roof opened up and a giant ATM machine came slowly down. Bingo, baby. Now, before I go on, Oprah, so we give Oprah the DNA test, right? The next day, Oprah goes to South Africa. And like many of you, you know, I'm a CNN junkie. Well, I used to be a CNN junkie before they made Donald Trump the president of the United States. And so I'm watching CNN, I'm in my study, and there's Oprah with Mandela announcing that she is going to create this private school for girls in South Africa. And she got so caught up in this big stadium, 70,000 people in this stadium in Johannesburg. And she was so caught up in the moment, she announced that she had just taken a DNA test 48 hours earlier, and the results were in, and she was a Zulu. And all these people went crazy, you know, they went crazy. And you know how CNN does? It was a news flash. Oprah Winfrey, Zulu. Oprah Winfrey, Zulu. I went, oh my God. So I called Rick Kittles, and I go, Rick, did you tell Oprah that she was a Zulu? He said, no, don't be crazy. Because, you know, like the Nubians, no Zulu people came in the slave trade either. So, practical man I am, I said, Rick, is there anybody in your lab? He said, no. I said, make her a Zulu. I wanted to say that, but I didn't, right? Well, I had the pleasant task of telling Oprah Winfrey she had no Zulu ancestry at all. How did I get into start to think about being in front of a camera and looking down a lens? Well, when I was thinking about this Haskins lecture, I realized that when I was a sophomore at Yale, I watched Kenneth Clark's Civilization. And I'm sure many of you have watched that as well. And though I was pre-med, I was a history major, but I was pre-med, I thought, wouldn't that be cool to be able to stand in front of a camera and lecture like Kenneth Clark and just communicate the secrets of the black world to thousands and thousands of people. But it was one of those fleeting things, you know, like a fantasy. I didn't even tell my girlfriend. I didn't tell anybody. My girlfriend, Linda Darling Hammond. Linda Darling and I were the Afro-coiffed item at Yale University that year, and we remained very, very good friends. I didn't even tell Linda. And then 2 years later, Jacob Bronowski did The Ascent of Man. And I watched that, but I didn't study film. I was pre-med, right? And but I just sort of filed these fantasies away. When I went to Harvard in 1991, Alberta Arthurs, who was at the Rockefeller Foundation, said, have you met Henry Hampton? And I know so many of you have seen Eyes on the Prize. Henry was the greatest black documentary filmmaker in history. And he lived in Boston. And so Alberta said, you guys are two forces of nature. You have to meet, right? And so she set up this meeting. And I went to his studio in the South End called Blackside. And when I left there, ladies and gentlemen, at the end of the day, I had tears in my eyes because it spoke to me. I really wanted to figure out a way to work with him. And I said, you know, Henry, in England, they put academics like me, I was saying, in front of a camera, like for Kenneth Clark. And in America, Jacob Bronowski. And he looked at me and he said, yeah, I've seen those. That's in England. And I went home and I thought, well, this is never, ever going to happen. And I can't believe, Joy, that you quoted from Loose Cannons, because it's pivotal to this story. I was on the book tour. Oxford published that book of essays. That was the first culture wars, or at least my generation's first culture wars of the 90s. We were trying to integrate the canon. We wanted the Norton anthologies to have 10% black authors, and then we wanted to do our own Norton anthology. That was like the good old days compared to what we're going through now, right? And Jane Root, who was a very prominent producer, had her own production company, was in bed watching me on a late night book talk show in London. And she said, I'm going to make put that guy in front of a camera. And she wrote to me, and Evelyn, I wanted it so badly, I couldn't believe this letter. I just threw the letter in the trash because I wanted it, but I didn't think I could do it. So I had that funny and exhilaration, but then self-doubt. But then she wrote me again, and she wrote me again, and she wrote me again. And finally, I'm the chair of the jury of the Annisfield Wolf Book Award in Cleveland. And I've done that for over 25 years. And I was making a presentation one year, and Jane flew all the way from London to have breakfast with me. And she said, you know, you really can do this thing. And we're going to put you in front of a camera. And she did. It was a steep learning curve. When my first film I did with my two daughters, who were 10 and 12. Who were 12 and 14. It was for the Great Rail Journey series. And we rode 3,000 miles on trains in Africa, from Bulawayo in Great Zimbabwe, all the way to Dar es Salaam. And then we went into the bush, into Dodoma on a train, then 4 hours into the bush, where I had lived in my gap year from Yale, when between sophomore year and junior year, working at an Anglican mission hospital, and we ended up filming there. And I had to learn on the job how to look at the camera and do what are called stand-ups, or pieces of camera. You know, when a reporter looks at you and says, well, today, you know, so-and-so many people were shot, or, you know, Joe Biden did this and that. You had to learn how to do that, and it was really hard. The first one that I did, I love 5x8 cards and 3x5 cards, and I had no training for this. So I wrote out what I wanted to say about Great Zimbabwe, and I go, Great Zimbabwe was founded in the 13th century. It was so bad. I looked at my daughters put their head down in shame, and our cameraman stopped filming, and he said, this is the worst piece of camera I ever saw in my whole life. I was so embarrassed. He said, we might as well go home. He said, this is a big pile of rocks. Why, it's ugly. we were Great Zimbabwe. Great Zimbabwe, the largest man-made structure south of the Sahara Desert. And he said, you know, who cares about all these rocks? I know, what are you talking about? This is the largest man-made structure south of the Sahara. Racist Europeans came here. It's so sophisticated in its architecture that racists said the black people who lived around here were too stupid to have created it. It was more likely that Martians landed here. This is a true story. That Martians landed here and built it than these stupid Africans did. And so I'm going off like that. He had picked up the camera and he was rolling, and when I finished, he said, "You've just done your first piece of the camera." And that was it. That was it. And I haven't looked back. So when, after I got Johnson & Johnson to pony up that money so the whole world could learn that Oprah is not a Zulu, we started putting the series together. Whoopi Goldberg was a friend of Oprah's, and she called my office about 1,000 times, and so we let her in. A nerdy pre-med guy I knew at Yale, you know, he didn't hang out much, Rick. He went on to have some success. I always forget his name. Ben Carson. Yeah, Ben Carson. You know, my barber, when he saw the first show, my barber said, "Doc," he calls me Doc. "Doc, you was hanging out with Ben Carson?" I said, "Yeah, he was a nice guy," and his wife Candy, we were all at Yale together. He said, "That must have been before he breathed all that ether." I said, "Well, you know, everybody's entitled to their own opinion." And Mae Jemison, the first female architect, astronaut, Suzanne Blier here writes about African architecture, so I got architecture on my brain. Quincy in the middle, there's a big O, and Chris Tucker, and my colleague Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot. And we launched African American Lives, and it was just a hit. So much so that PBS asked me, and this time they gave me some money, they asked me to do a sequel. So I asked Maya Angelou, who's a good friend and Oprah's best friend. I had to do Morgan Freeman, because anybody who plays both God and the president, you got to do his DNA, right? And then Tina Turner. I've had a thing for Tina Turner since I was 10 years old. So that was shamelessly, I just did Tina Turner. So, and that, really big hit. Then I got a letter from a Jewish lady. "Dear Dr. Gates, I've always admired your stances on cultural pluralism and multiculturalism, but after watching African American Lives 1 and 2, I've decided that you're a big fat racist because you only do black people. How about Jewish people? How about Asian people?" And I was shocked, actually, and ashamed, a bit ashamed. And I thought, wow, you know, my whole brand is blackness, right? That's what I do. I wonder, could I do white people? And so I called our account representative at Coca-Cola, a black woman named Ingrid Saunders Jones. I called her cell phone, and I said, "Ingrid, I'm holding a letter from a Jewish lady who says I'm a racist." She goes, "What?" "Because we don't do white people in the series. Can we do white people?" So it turns out that Ingrid was in a board meeting, and she got up and walked down the corridor. And I thought the call had dropped, and I go, "Ingrid, Ingrid, Ingrid, Ingrid," and I start yelling, "Ingrid," and I'm about to hang up, and she said, "Skip, don't hang up, don't hang up. I was with all these white people." She said, "I don't want him to hear this conversation." I go, "Well, Ingrid, what's the answer?" And she said, "I only have one thing to say to you." And I said, "What?" She said, "There are a lot more white people drinking Coke than black people." I took that as a yes. And then I had the problem, how do you pick white people? I know how to pick black people, but how do you pick white people? And what about all the world's other people? So I decided to do what I thought Noah would do. 2 white people, 2 Jewish people, 2 Asian people, and that's what we did. We had Catholic and Italian, we had Yo-Yo Ma, Chinese, Chrissy Yamaguchi, who's Japanese, Meryl Streep, just because she's Meryl Streep. I didn't care what ethnicity she was. And 2 West Indians, people of West Indian descent, Elizabeth Alexander, who was my student. Of course, she's the president of the Mellon Foundation. She's Jamaican on her father's side. And Malcolm Gladwell, whose mother is Jamaican. And we introduced autosomal DNA. When I started African American Lives, the DNA cousins, autosomal analysis didn't even exist. And so that we really rode the wave of the commercialization of ancestral genetic analysis, and many of those scientists introduced new procedures, new techniques in our series, and one was autosomal DNA that allows you to see if you and anyone in this room over the last 500 years happen to share an ancestry in common, because if you do, you would have long identical segments of DNA. And someone then threatened to sue us, and so PBS told me to change the name, and I came up with Finding Your Roots. And as you have heard from Joy's wonderful introduction, we just finished season 9, and we're filming season 10 right now. So I just want to end by showing you just a couple things to run through. How are we doing for time, Joy? Okay, 20 minutes. Okay, great. I have learned so many things doing this series. The first thing about the transatlantic slave trade, there were 12.5 million Africans shipped to the New World across the Atlantic between 1500 and 1866. 15% die in the Middle Passage. 10.7 million get off the boats. How many come to the United States? How many? Anybody? 4 million. Anybody over here? Yeah, Rick, but you read my slide, Turkey. Rick and I have been friends for a long time, till tonight. It is so hard to believe. Only 388,000 Africans came to the United States. 5 million went to Brazil. 980,000 went to Cuba. 772,000 went to Saint Domingue, which on January 1st, 1804 became the independent Republic of Haiti. 1 million went to Jamaica. Only 388,000 came to the United States. And we know through the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which you could look up now on your mobile phones, where they came from. We know that 25% of our ancestors came from Senegambia, and another 25% from Congo, Angola. So chances are, if we did the DNA of the black people in this room, there's a likelihood that you're either from Senegambia, one ethnic group, or from Congo, Angola. And on the eve of the Civil War, there were 4.4 million African Americans in the United States. 3.9 million were enslaved, 488,000 were free, and the astonishing thing is that there were more free black people living in the South, in the Confederacy, than living in the North. 225,000 in the South, 225,000 in the North, and 261,000 in the South. And those free people of color lived, by and large, unmolested in the South throughout the war. When the 15th Amendment is ratified in December of 1865, and that's the only thing, that is what abolished slavery. It wasn't an Emancipation Proclamation. It was the ratification of the 15th Amendment. The Freedmen's Bureau, one of the many things that it did was to give the newly freed slaves the outline of a family tree. Frederick Douglass famously said that genealogical trees do not grow in slavery. And so even then, with the Freedmen's Bureau, there was an acute awareness that central to these people becoming citizens would be knowledge of their ancestry. And this is one of those forms that was passed out to enslaved people. And you could see antebellum, postbellum, before the war and since the war, encouraging them to try to remember the names of their parents and their grandparents. So the three biggest myths of African American genealogy, or I am descended from an Igbo princess. That's the first thing. Now, it just so happens that 16% of our ancestors did come from Igbo land, from eastern Nigeria. But were the princesses sold into the slave trade? No. The second one was, our family never was slaves. We were royalty. We just ended up here in some kind of fluke. And Vernon Jordan's wife once told me that her ancestor was an Igbo princess. And she got off the slave ship. And a German count saw her and said, look at that fine Igbo princess. And she is not meant to be a slave. And he went over and bought her from the captain, and they lived happily ever after. And I was sitting in Vernon's house on Martha's Vineyard, and Ann, his wife, they're very good friends. Both of them, well, Ann's still with us, but Vernon's not. And she told me that, and we were about to have dinner. And I started to laugh, and she said, what are you laughing at? And I said, oh, nothing, nothing, because I was very hungry. But believe me, I don't think that that actually happened. The third thing, I would like to ask the African Americans in this room, now don't be shy. How many of you know that you descend from Native American ancestors? Please put your records up. Put your hands up. Look at that. For all you white people, if you could see all these black people put their hands up, almost. None of y'all got Native American ancestors. It is the biggest, you know, the average African American, let me see. Oh, no, well, I can't do that. I'm going to get the Jewish people next. The average African American, there's a slide down the road here, I'll show you. The average African American is 24% European. This is your admixture over the last 500 years. 24% European and 0.8% Native American. The average African American ancestor of ours and the average Native American never even saw each other. If you were from Oklahoma, you got a good shot, right? Because the 5 so-called civilized tribes, Creek, the Choctaw, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, and the Seminole. Why were they called the civilized tribes? Because they embraced Christianity, they read the Bible, they embraced English, and they owned black slaves. So you had a chance. But by and large, this is just a myth. Your great-great-grandmother's high cheekbones and straight black hair were a result of all that white ancestry. And where did the white ancestry come from? Rape, cajoled sexuality during slavery. So, before I show the next slide, how many Jewish people in this room were told that your ancestor's name was changed on Ellis Island? Okay? All right, that's a fair amount. All right, you ready for this? Fasten your seatbelt. It never happened. It never happened. You know, you can never say never, but nobody has ever found the case where it actually happened. And you read this, I'm going to read it out loud. I wrote it out because I didn't want to try to memorize it, because I knew that Jewish people were going to be beating on me when I revealed this information. U.S. immigration officials at Ellis Island and other arrival ports never had the opportunity to change someone's name as immigrants were being processed. In fact, prior to World War II, U.S. officials did not create any documents that could have been used by immigrants as identification after they arrived. You want to know why? The passenger lists were created by the shipping lines in Europe and handed to U.S. authorities when the ship pulled into port. All the names are registered in Europe. That book was given to the captain. The captain landed at Ellis Island. He gave it to the authorities. The names and personal information on the ship's passenger list would have been conveyed by the immigrants themselves in Europe, or whoever paid for their ticket at the time their passage was purchased. Immigrants often changed their names after they arrived, but the change didn't happen as immigrants passed through Ellis Island or any other port of entry. This is one of the grand myths of American genealogy. Now, I know you're still skeptical, but it is absolutely true. All right, I am going to end by showing you people always ask me, what are your favorite moments in Finding Your Roots? And I have 4 clips if you indulge me, that I want to share, and then we'll wrap up. The biggest surprise was when they did meet. Once we had ways to analyze autosomal DNA, I am the most DNA-tested black man in the history of the world. There's no question, no question about that. My father and I were fully sequenced back in 2009, which at the time cost $300,000 to do. They gave, because it was for PBS, they gave us a deal for $50,000. Now that it's $5,000 at most to be fully sequenced. And he and I became the first father and son to be fully sequenced and have our genomes publicly released. And it turned out that I am 48% sub-Saharan African and 48% European. In other words, the chair of black studies at Harvard was half a white man. And that, I found that very embarrassing at the time, but that was just the way it was. No, that's a joke, you all. And my Native American ancestry at that time was 0.6%, and now I think it's up to 1%. My family members had a summit, and they called me, Otto, and they said, they had all these pictures of granny and great-great-grandmothers, and they said, Skippy, stop embarrassing our family, telling them lies that we're not Native Americans. You know, look at these photographs. We're definitely Native Americans. This is my full family tree, which is quite astonishing because, remember, I'm busy looking across the ocean trying to find my African origins, when it turns out that the most amazing thing about my genealogy was unfolding basically at my feet. I'm descended from 3 sets of free people of color. 2 sets were freed by the American Revolution. The 3rd set, Joe and Sarah Bruce, on my father's side, were freed in 1823, and they lived 15 miles from where I was born. My family never moved for 200 years. I'm a Redman on my mother's side, and I'm a Redman on my father's side. And remember Jane Gates with those 5 children, and remember how she was magically able to pony up $1,200 and buy a house in a white neighborhood 6 years after gaining her freedom. My Y-DNA goes not to Africa at all, but straight to Ireland. I have R1b, 1b, 2a, 1a, 2f2. That is the O'Neill haplotype. 10% of the men in Dublin and I have exactly the same Y-DNA, and you can see from those little egg yolks where my paternal ancestry traces to. And on my mother's side, where in Africa does it go? It goes to Northern Europe. I am one of the few African Americans who is descended on his father's side, father's side, from a white man, and on my mother's side from a white woman. No doubt a white woman who was an indentured servant, probably in Maryland, and who was impregnated by a black man. So if a Martian came down and just looked at my DNA profile using the mitochondrial DNA and Y-DNA, they would think that I was white. And here you can see another representation. So, and here's my Neanderthal, and and I'm 1.7% Neanderthal. Only Europeans mated with the Neanderthals, so we know that Africans were too cool to do that. So we know that came through my white ancestry. So I want to end with 4 clips, because as I started to say, I'm asked, what are my favorite stories? When I started this series, ladies and gentlemen, I thought Oprah Winfrey would spit in a test tube and some African ethnic group would pop out. I had no idea where this would lead to. I could not possibly, in 2003 when I got the idea, imagine the wonders of autosomal DNA, or the cheapness of, the affordability of very sophisticated DNA tests that would yield such amazing results. And it never occurred to me that people would seek us out, or that we would do someone's DNA and discover what genealogists euphemistically called non-paternity events. And that is a very serious business. So first, Taya Leone reached out, you know, Madam Secretary. Her mother was adopted. She asked if we could solve the mystery.
So on the next page, I'm going to show you a chart.
Can you turn it
that
up a little
compares
bit?
your mother's DNA to our tester's DNA. Any segments that they share will be highlighted in red.
Okay.
You ready to find out?
Yeah.
Would you please turn the page? Do you see a lot of red or you see little red?
I see a lot of red. Shared DNA, 26%.
And I said that if they share 25%, then they shared a mother.
Right.
Your biological grandmother is a woman named Abilene Gindrat. I want to show you something. Will you turn the page?
Yeah. Who's that?
That's your grandmother.
God. She looks like my mom a lot. Boy, that is... I mean, even just the way she holds her head.
Really?
Yeah.
I had to, LL Cool J's Todd Smith, and when Quincy's daughter, Rashida, came to campus, Todd came with him. I didn't even know who he was. Right? I went home, my daughter said, "You idiot, you know, that's LL Cool J." So I asked him to be in the series. We did his DNA analysis. All of our DNA analysis, by the way, is led by a woman named C.C. Moore, who is a genetic genealogist. She was profiled in the New Yorker 2 Decembers ago, and I encourage you to read it. She developed the protocol that's used to solve the cold cases. She solved over 200 cold cases. I heard her in 2013 give a lecture at a conference, and I hired her on the spot. And I knew it would forever change the nature of finding your roots. So she called me and said, we have a problem. LL Cool J's mother was adopted, and she doesn't know it. So we've developed a very, very sophisticated ethics protocol. I have it written out, and whenever we discover a non-paternity event, in Taya's case, her mother knew she was adopted. Taya wanted us to find the biological parents, which we did. In LL's case, he had no idea, nor did his mother, who's very much alive. So I had to call him and tell him after we had talked to ethicists. And by the way, all of our DNA results are vetted by the Broad Institute at Harvard and 2 other major geneticists in the United States. And C.C. Moore has never made a mistake. I mean, this woman is a genius. So I had to call him and tell him that his mother was adopted, and the grandparents who raised him were not his biological kin. Now, this was very, very problematic because Todd's father shot his mother in the middle of the night. And when she got out of the hospital, she moved out of his house, thank God, and moved in with her parents. And so Todd's grandparents are like his parents. He's even written a book about them. And in his first music video called Mama, I'ma Knock You Out, and that knock you out, as you'll see in a minute, is a very important metaphor. At the very end, this little old lady comes down the stairs and says, "Todd, take the garbage out," right? So he loved these people, and I had to call him to tell him that unbeknownst to his mother, she had been adopted, and these people had absolutely no biological connection, and he went crazy. He cussed me out, and I mean, I won't even say what he said, and it's the first time I had to do it. Now I've done it a lot of times. There was a lot of what black people call sneaking and creeping in the 50s and the 60s, I'm telling you. And so he said, "Well, what am I supposed to do?" And I said, "Well, if I were you, I'd call your mother and talk to her about it." He called me back in 5 minutes. He was on the set of NCIS. And he called back, and I said, "Jesus, this guy's going to yell at me all over again." And I said, "Hey, Todd, what's up?" And I said, "What'd she say?" He said, "My mom said, could my father be my father, but my mother not be my real mother?" And that meant she had a suspicion that she had been adopted. And I said, well, tell me what she said. When she was about 12, her aunt had a baby, and all the women were in the parlor. And Todd's mother goes in, 12-year-old, and says, oh, I want to have a baby that looks just like that when I grow up. And the evil aunt said, honey, that can't happen. And that night, she went to her mother and said, Mama, am I adopted? Mother said, no. She asked her mother 3 times, including on her mother's deathbed. And the mother couldn't bring herself to tell her. And so we told her. I clicked, okay. That's your mother's DNA compared to the DNA of a woman named Claudia Lewis. And the DNA that they shared is highlighted in red. And can you see how much red there is?
It's a lot of red, man.
Your mother and Claudia share 24.7% of their DNA. They are, without a doubt, half-siblings.
Wow. Claudia Lewis.
Claudia Lewis. Claudia Lewis is the daughter of Nathaniel Christie Lewis.
Wow.
That means that your mother's biological father was a man named Nathaniel Christie Lewis. He is your biological grandfather.
Yeah, that's heavy. I mean, you know, you couldn't have told me in 1,000 years, in 1,000,000 years, that this was the case in my life.
Thanks to CeCe's genetic detective work, I can now introduce LL Cool J to the biological grandfather he never knew he had.
Wow.
It looked just like him.
He's a good-looking dude.
You were looking at a photograph of your biological grandfather, Nathaniel Christie Lewis. You see any family resemblance?
Oh, definitely. Oh, yeah, I see it.
Really?
Yeah, his lips. Mm-hmm. He got that nose. He has the nose. He got the look. Oh, my goodness. I guess my first question would be, where were you? Mm-hmm. You know? The flip side is it's miraculous to be able to have this. This is such a blessing.
And then,
according to his vital records, Nathaniel Christie Lewis, who went by the name Christie, was born in 1913 outside Phoenix, Arizona. And it wasn't long before we found his name all over the newspapers. It turns out that from a very young age, Christie and his brother, LL's great-uncle John Henry, had been famous athletes. And remarkably, they excelled at a sport that LL has always loved.
now this is an article from a famous black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier.
Before his 4th year was over, John Henry and Christie were diligently engaged in learning the box. The 2 boys proved to be a sensation. Their services as juvenile fistic showmen were in great demand. Man, I mean, you know, I'm such a boxing fan. My mother's a boxing fan. My mother loved boxing. You know, I mean, even on my 2nd album cover, I'm on the back of my album cover punching a heavy bag.
It is uncanny.
It's
really totally uncanny.
I mean, you know, it makes you wonder if your DNA carries shadows or consciousness.
Yeah, things that are coded.
It's in there, man.
The Holocaust. I couldn't imagine that anything would be more different than tracing African-American genealogy back into the abyss of slavery. But as you know, 1791, Catherine the Great confined the Jews of the Russian Empire to the Pale of Settlement, where they lived for a very, very long time until as far as we're concerned, until the Great Migration started occurring 1880s, 1890s, and beyond. But so Holocaust stories and Eastern European Jewry, doing that research, we've become very, very good at that. And I want to share a very moving story with that we revealed to Mandy Patinkin.
On November 2nd, 1942, the Germans and their collaborators surrounded the Bronx ghetto. Its inhabitants were loaded onto wagons and taken to a nearby town, where more than 2,000 of them were packed into trains bound for Treblinka, a concentration camp. Their fate was now sealed.
On the 10th, everyone is already in Treblinka. According to the evidence, all the Bronsk Jews, men and women separately, breathed their last in the Treblinka gas chambers on the 10th of November, 1942, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Their bodies were burned in the crematorium in Treblinka. Oh my God. You know, I went there and I would say to people, I've been interviewed so many times, I said, I don't think any of my relatives died in the Holocaust. I was never given this information. This is, I don't have words. That's unbelievable. Almighty. That's unreal. Man. Whew.
And finally, I'll show you a clip and then I'll wrap with three lines. The saint, I mean, the closest person to a saint that I've ever met is the late Congressman John Lewis. Is when Barack gave him the National Medal of Freedom. And so it was a great honor to do his family tree. And one of the things that I tell people when we sit down is that sometimes they're going to learn, these reveals take about 4 or 5 hours. And then we reduce it to 30 minutes in the edit. And that sometimes they're going to learn that patterns, like in LL's case, have trickled down the branches of your family tree in some kind of weird way that no one can explain. LL says, well, maybe it's in your DNA. I don't think so. But their habits become socialized, part of a family's culture, even if they don't talk about it, sometimes particularly if they don't talk about family. It's like the return of the repressed, you all know. The Yoruba have the same concept, that the corpse you buried in your backyard last week is poking its toe through the soil today. That's the return of the repressed. And so even when you run from the lie is there, you know, it pops out. But also, there are precedents that, unbeknownst to you, you are recapitulating that an ancestral basis. And here's my favorite.
Advance toward the gate. See that they disperse.
The images captured that day in Selma are seared onto our national consciousness. And as we look at them today, it seems unbelievable that the African American right to vote could have posed such a profound threat as to incite this kind of violence.
The vote is the most powerful instrument, most powerful nonviolent tool in a democratic society. But knowing that a member of my family registered and voted in Alabama 100 years before I did, before my mother, my father, my grandparents. It's amazing. So maybe, just maybe, it's part of my DNA, my bloodline, or whatever you want to call it.
I mean, who would have believed that your ancestors were the pioneering people who voted in the state of Alabama among the former slaves?
This is incredible. This is too much.
The takeaway from Finding Your Roots, and this has been a profound lesson for me, is that, you know, we're a nation of immigrants. Martin Luther King gave a commencement address at Stanford in which he said, we're a nation of exiles. So it's very common for us to talk about being a nation of immigrants, but you think that we are a nation of exiles, that's quite profound. My African ancestors weren't voluntary immigrants, but they were unwilling immigrants nonetheless. Even our Native American sisters and brothers migrated here 15,000 years ago across the Bering Strait. At the level of the genome, we show guess after guess after guess. We are 99.99% the same. I saw a poll, the poll results in Washington Post, and they'd interviewed inner city black kids in DC. And the poll said, list things that are white. And you know what the top 3 things were? Speaking standard English, getting straight A's in school, and visiting the Smithsonian. And I was so disturbed by that. And that we're losing our kids, and their STEM skills are so horrible. So it occurred to me that given the reaction, 4 million people a week watch Finding Your Roots. It's the #1 show on series on PBS. People stop me all over. Like, guys with "Make America Great Again" hats on. One guy at the airport stopped me and said, "Can I stop?" I looked at him. Yeah. He said, "I don't like your politics, but I love your show. Can I have a photograph?" I said, "Yes, sir, you can have a photograph." So it occurred to me, what if we could have every kid in middle school and high school do their family tree, right? So that in social studies class, they would have a 6-week unit learning how to trace their own ancestors. So they would learn archival skills. We take them back now to the 1950 federal census, which is online, and then keep going backwards, 1940, back to the magic 1870 federal census, which is the first census in which all African Americans were listed by name, because the enslaved people weren't listed by name in the census since they were quote unquote property. And we would teach them how to, and then we found them in the, say like we did Oprah in Atala County, Mississippi, in Constantine Winfrey, her great-great-grandfather. You look for a white man by the same name. And it turned out Absalom Winfrey lived next to him. Then we looked at the slave schedule in 1860, and Absalom Winfrey owned an enslaved black man exactly 10 years younger than Oprah's great-great-grandfather. And then you look in their estate records, their wills, their probate records, when you had to list your enslaved people by first name. I give to my daughter my 12-year-old slave named Joy. And that's how you begin to match it up. Ironically, the secret to black genealogical identity in antebellum America is buried in white records, the records of the enslavers. It's so curious and so paradoxical. So you light them on fire about archival research, like these 2 great historians right here. Then we go down to the science class. And we have every kid take their spit in a test tube. And we wait 6 weeks for the results to come in. And then we teach them how, about the double helix and Watson and Crick, and how mitochondrial DNA works, and what's admixture, what's autosomal DNA, and how Y DNA works, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when their results come in, they share those results, and then they do a complicated family tree report, combining the genealogical record with the scientific analysis. Who wouldn't be turned on to science or archival research with that kind of curriculum? Why? Because what's your favorite subject? Your favorite subject is yourself. And that is what this is all about. So I am hoping, we got $1 million grant to do a prototype called Finding Your Roots of Siblings. You can see the results online. It's open that anybody can see it. I am hoping that we can get school system, not in Florida, where I am banned too, and I'm hoping that we can get some school system to try this. And my goal is to reverse that trend that we saw in that poll so long ago from the Washington Post. When we were growing up, the blackest thing you could be was an educated man or an educated woman, and too many of our impoverished kids, black kids, brown kids. I grew up in West Virginia. And impoverished white kids too. Poverty is a culture. Poverty is colorblind. And the symptoms of impoverishment manifest themselves all across the ethnic spectrum. I believe that we can use the fascination that people have with genealogy and genetic genealogy, in the case of my own community, not to take our people back to the future, but to take them black to the future. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you. Thank you.